If you were a 19-year-old Argentine conscript dug into the cold ground above Stanley in the winter of 1982, there was one piece of news that travelled faster than any artillery barrage. It was not about the paras. It was not about the Royal Marines. It was 3 words passed down the trench line in the dark. The Gurkhas are coming. Most of those young men had never seen a Gurkha. What they had heard was worse than anything they'd seen. Stories, half true and half legend, about small men from the mountains of Nepal who carried a curved knife and did not take prisoners, who moved at night and were on you before you knew the line had been crossed. By the time the British actually reached their positions, the fear had already done a great deal of the fighting. This is the Falklands War, told from the wrong end of the rifle. The story of what it was like to be the people the Gurkhas were sent to find. That is one way to tell the story of the last week of the war. It is the way it has usually been told. The small men, the curved knives, the boys who broke and ran. It is a good story, and like most good stories about that week, it is mostly wrong. So before we go any further, hold 2 things in your mind at once. The first is the fear. The fear was real. It was documented, it was widespread, and it shaped how the war ended. The second is what actually happened when the men those boys feared finally arrived. Because the gap between those 2 things, between the dread and the deed, is the whole point of what follows. This is a reconstruction told from the losing side, built out of memoir and testimony is always partial. One frightened man's night is not every man's night. We will mark the difference between what we can document and what only the rumour can supply. The line between the 2 is exactly the thing worth examining. Start with the ground itself, because the ground tells you most of what you need to know. East Falkland in June is the southern winter. Sleet comes sideways off the South Atlantic. The peat holds water like a sponge, so a trench dug at dusk is a trench half flooded by dawn. There are no trees to break the wind, only low ridges of broken rock and a sky the colour of slate. Into this, in April and May of 1982, Argentina had moved more than 10,000 troops. The great majority of them were conscripts. By the figures the historians have settled on, the average soldier had been under the colours for perhaps 6 months. Many had expected to be discharged that autumn and to go home. Instead, they were on an island most of them could not have found on a map a year before, told it was theirs, and told to hold it. It is worth saying who these conscripts actually were, because the popular picture of them is a caricature, and the caricature does them an injustice that this account is built to undo. They were drawn from every corner of Argentina, from Buenos Aires and the provinces, from the cattle country and the cities, and a great many of them from the warm provinces of the north, where a boy might reach 18, having never in his life seen snow. Now they were on a treeless island in the far South Atlantic in the dead of the southern winter, dressed and fed for a campaign that the men who sent them had not planned with much care. The historian Martin Middlebrook, the one British writer Argentina allowed to interview its own servicemen at length, found unit after unit in this condition. The 12th Regiment, among the last sent across, arrived to find that much of its heavy equipment, its support gear, its means of communication had simply never come. 3/4 of the force were conscripts, and their training, in Middlebrook's careful phrase, was deficient. These were not professional soldiers. They were teenagers in uniform, far from anything they knew. Consider one of them, because the war is easier to understand through one man than through 10,000. Alejandro Villanueva was 18, from City Bell near La Plata. His military service was nearly finished. His discharge had been set for the 10th of April. It never came. He was sent south instead, to the cold. Years later, on the 40th anniversary, he described the 2 months that followed in flat, unsparing language. They sheltered outdoors. They drank water from puddles and tried to melt snow in the weak sun. They hardly ate. What food arrived was, in his word, terrible. Near Stanley, he marched some 20 kilometres into a headwind, carrying heavy equipment, before he reached the trenches he would hold. His account is one man's, and we should treat it as one man's, partial, individual, recalled across 40 years, not the testimony of every soldier on the island. But it rhymes with almost everything else we have. There is another voice, from a collection of conscript interviews gathered shortly after the war, that puts the bewilderment more simply than any historian could. Crouched in a trench with the shelling overhead, the soldier said they could not understand how Britain and Argentina had failed to come to an agreement. That is the war from inside the hole. Not strategy, not sovereignty, but a boy under fire who cannot grasp why the grown-ups have not stopped this yet. What we have is grim and consistent. The conscripts spent 6 weeks in those trenches, cold and hungry, while the officers, by many accounts, lived in relative comfort, with stores and food behind them. There are stories, repeated often enough across separate testimonies to carry weight, of boys queuing outside a farmer's cowshed for a mug of milk straight from the animal, simply to feel warm for a moment. When the prisoners were finally taken at the end, British soldiers and islanders alike described them the same way: gaunt, hollow-cheeked, half-starved. The cases of trench foot were worse still. Feet rotting in waterlogged boots after weeks in the open. This is the body the fear arrived to. Not a confident army, a cold, wet, frightened one. A long way from home, fighting a war a great many of them did not fully understand. Now hold that picture, because the temptation here is the oldest one in war stories: to make these boys either villains or comedy. They were neither. And it matters that we get this right, because the entire shape of what follows depends on it. If you cannot sit inside their fear and feel it as real, the rest of this is just another story about scary men with knives. So sit with it. You are 19. You have not eaten properly in weeks. Your feet have stopped feeling like your own. The shelling comes most nights now, walking up the ridges towards Stanley, closer each time. And down the trench, in the dark, a voice tells you who is coming next. Who was coming was a battalion of Nepalese soldiers in British uniform. And to understand the dread, you have to understand the reputation that arrived ahead of them, because the reputation is older than any of the men carrying it. The Gurkhas had served the British Crown since the early 19th century. The relationship began, as these things often do, in a war. Between 1814 and 1816, the British East India Company fought the Gurkha kingdom in the hills of Nepal. And the men of the hills fought them to a standstill, so fierce and with such evident courage that the British came away wanting them on their own side. From that point on, Nepalese soldiers served in British ranks across 2 centuries and 2 world wars. By 1982, the regiment facing east towards Stanley traced an unbroken line back through Burma, through the deserts of North Africa, through the mud of the Western Front. Generations of soldiers from other armies had met them, and the meeting had left a residue. A half-remembered sense, passed from veteran to recruit, that there was a certain kind of soldier you did not want coming for you in the dark. None of the boys above Stanley had fought a Gurkha, but the idea of the Gurkha had reached them anyway, the way ideas do, ahead of the fact, carrying more weight than the fact could ever have carried alone. There is even a regimental motto that had drifted out into the wider world along with the rest of the legend, that it is better to die than to live a coward. To a frightened conscript, that is not a recruiting slogan, it is a threat. And then there is the knife. The kukri, sometimes written kukuri, is the curved blade of Nepal, heavy at the tip, designed so the weight does the work. It is the national weapon of the country, and for a Gurkha, as much a tool as an arm. You cut rope with it, you clear brush with it. But around that ordinary object had grown an extraordinary mythology. There is a line, repeated for generations, that a Gurkha may not sheathe his kukri until it has tasted blood. That if he draws it and does not use it, he must nick his own thumb before putting it away. It is a wonderful, terrible image. It is also, as far as any historian can establish, a legend rather than a rule of conduct. But legends do not need to be true to do their work. They only need to be believed. And by June 1982, on a cold island in the South Atlantic, they were believed completely. Here is where we have to be careful, because this is the seam where documented fact and accumulated story run together, and the whole video lives along that seam. What is documented is the fear. What is far less certain is everything the fear was supposedly built on. After the war, Argentine soldiers told reporters about rumours that had moved through their lines, that the Gurkhas slipped into foxholes at night, that they had taken the lives of dozens of men in single strokes of the curved knife, that they did not, under any circumstances, take prisoners. One of the strangest versions held that the British would harm captives, and that the Gurkhas in particular were not to be surrendered to under any circumstances. These stories were vivid, specific, and almost entirely unsupported by anything that actually happened. We will come back to how thoroughly the record contradicts them. For now, the point is simpler. The rumour did not need to be accurate to be effective. It only needed to reach a frightened, hungry 19-year-old in a flooded trench at 2 a.m. Where did it come from? On this, the record genuinely divides, and we should say so plainly. One account holds that the British, or the islanders, deliberately seeded the fear. There is at least one report of a leaflet found on the islands, recovered by a clearance diver during his duties. But the weight of the evidence, including from the men who served alongside the Gurkhas, points the other way. Major Mike Sear, an officer of the very battalion in question, and later its foremost chronicler, traced the stories not to British design, but to Argentine tabloid television and the popular press. Not the serious national newspapers, but the noisier end of the media, which had inflated the Gurkha legend into something monstrous. The fear, in other words, may have been largely homegrown, an army frightening itself. We cannot settle this dispute, and we will not pretend to. But it is worth pausing on, because if it is true, then the most powerful weapon on that battlefield was a story the losing side told itself. So the reputation crossed the lines before the men did. And now we come to the part that the legend always leaves out. What those men were actually doing, and where they actually were. The battalion was the 1st Battalion 7th Duke of Edinburgh's own Gurkha Rifles, in the shorthand of the army, 1-7 Gurkha Rifles. They were part of 5 Infantry Brigade, and they had come the long way to get there. They had sailed from Southampton on the 12th of May aboard the great ocean liner Queen Elizabeth II and come ashore at San Carlos Bay at the start of June. There is a photograph in the National Army Museum of them on that shore, digging defensive positions into the same cold peat the Argentines knew so well. For most of the campaign, they did what reserve infantry do. They waited, they marched, they dug, and they were shelled. Their heaviest single use of weapons in the whole war came on the 8th of June, when one of their companies fired some 4,000 rounds, not at advancing infantry, but upward at Argentine aircraft.
Then came the final week, and the ring of hills west and north of Stanley fell one after another. On the 11th and 12th of June, 3 of those hills went in a single night. Mount Longdon to the Paras, 2 Sisters to the Royal Marines of 45 Commando, Mount Harriet to 42 Commando. 2 nights later, it was the turn of the inner ring, Wireless Ridge, taken by 2 Para, and Mount Tumbledown, the steep rock spine that was the last real barrier, assigned to the 2nd Battalion, Scots Guards. And here, the Gurkhas finally had their task. They were to come up behind the Scots Guards, move along a feature called Goat Ridge, just to the north of Tumbledown, and take the sub-peak beyond it, Mount William. If they took it, the Welsh Guards could push on to Sapper Hill, the last height before the town. The plan was to do it in darkness, across ground that was almost certainly mined. It did not go to plan, and the way it failed to go to plan is the heart of the matter. The Scots Guards' fight for Tumbledown was long and hard, and it ran on into the dawn. That meant the Gurkhas could not make their approach in the dark as intended. As the sun came up on the 14th of June, they were moving in daylight, in the open, short of their objective, and the Argentine guns found them. They took casualties there. 4 men wounded a few days earlier by shrapnel, and 8 more, 2 of them seriously, on that final morning. Every one of those wounds came from shell fire. Not one came from the contested knife-to-knife assault the legend promised. There is a small human detail recorded from that morning that tells you something about the men on the receiving end of the same shells the conscripts were enduring. One of the Gurkha officers, a captain commanding part of D Company, came under fire as they advanced and remarked, to no one in particular, that it was all jolly exciting. It is a line from a different war, almost, the unbothered understatement of a professional soldier doing the thing he had trained his whole life to do. And it is worth holding next to the boy in the trench ahead of him, because the same artillery was falling on both of them, and only one of them was frightened of it. That gap between the man who finds it exciting and the boy who finds it the end of the world is most of what this story is about. By the time the Gurkhas reached Mount William, there was almost no one left on it to fight. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the quiet centre of the whole story. Mount William, the objective the curved knives were sent to take, was largely abandoned before they got there. According to the men who advanced, and we should be honest that this rests on their accounts rather than on any single archival tally, the defenders had already begun streaming toward the nearby Scots Guards to surrender, or were withdrawing towards Stanley as fast as the ground allowed. One Gurkha officer who was there, interviewed years later, remembered his sector offering almost no resistance at all. The enemy in front of him simply went. The regiment's own histories record the advance with something close to disappointment. They had trained for years, sailed 8,000 miles, and arrived to find the position emptying ahead of them. Their commanding officer would later admit, with regret, that the battalion had been able to play only a minor part in the victory. And this is precisely where the careful viewer should slow down, because it would be easy to draw the wrong lesson. Easy to say the Argentines were cowards, that they simply ran. They did not, and the record is emphatic on this point. On Tumbledown, a few hundred metres away, the men of the 5th Marine Infantry Battalion, under Commander Carlos Rabasio, held against the Scots Guards for 4 to 5 hours in the dark. They were a cold-weather-trained Marine unit with a hard professional corps, and they fought like one. On Mount Longdon, conscripts of the 7th Infantry Regiment held their ground and made the Paras pay for every position. The fear did not break the Argentine army. It broke the part of it that was least able to withstand it,
The undertrained, the underfed, the boys who had been in the open too long, in the wrong place, hearing the wrong stories. That is not cowardice. That is what fear does to the exhausted. And the rumour of the curved knife found those men first. So picture the 14th of June from inside one of those positions on Mount William, in the last hour before it emptied. You have been told for weeks who is coming. You have not slept properly in longer than you can remember. The hills behind you have been falling all night. You have heard the gunfire walking closer along the ridgeline. Longdon, then Two Sisters, then Tumbledown, each one nearer than the last. And now, in the grey light, you can see movement on Goat Ridge. You cannot make out faces at that distance. You do not need to. You already know who they are, because you have been told, and the telling was enough. The decision that follows is not really a military decision at all. It is what a frightened, freezing 19-year-old does when the thing he has dreaded for a month finally appears on the skyline. He puts down the rifle. He walks toward the nearest enemy who is not Nepalese, and he gives himself up. By the accounts of the men advancing, that is more or less what happened across the whole sector. The position the curved knives were sent to take gave up before the knives arrived. And the strange, almost unbearable irony is that the rumour had done the one thing it was never meant to do for the people who spread it. A good piece of psychological pressure, the people who study these things will tell you, makes the enemy fight harder or surrender on your terms. But fear pitched this high does something else. It empties a position that might otherwise have been defensible, hands it over without a contest, and ends the thing faster than any assault could. The Argentine High Command had understood the underlying problem early. With an army built largely of conscripts, General Menendez had chosen to stand on the defensive rather than attack. But no defensive plan survives contact with men who are too frightened to stay in their holes. And so the end came not as a single climactic clash, but as a slow collapse, position by position, in the cold. By the afternoon of the 14th, the inner ring had gone. Tumbledown, Wireless Ridge, Sapper Hill. Stanley itself lay open below, and there was nothing left to hold. At around 9 o'clock that evening, in Government House, Brigadier General Mario Benjamin Menendez signed the instrument of surrender, handing it to the British Land Commander, Major General Jeremy Moore. At Menendez's request, the word unconditional was struck from the document. His men kept their flags, their officers kept their sidearms, and the ceremony was kept private. Then the counting began. More than 11,000 Argentine personnel came down off the hills and out of the town to lay down their arms. The great majority of them were conscripts, the boys with 6 months' service and feet they could no longer feel. They were disarmed, gathered, and in time sent home. For Alejandro Villanueva, the boy from City Bell, the end of the war was a night spent under guard in the Stanley post office, and then, the next day, the strangest passage of all, being moved out to a great white ocean liner riding offshore, the requisitioned cruise ship Canberra, by means of a rope ladder slung over its side. He climbed it in the cold, a prisoner now, and he remembered the feeling exactly, that he was going to die at any moment, the whole way up. He did not die. He went home. But the fear did not leave him on the ladder, and for a great many of these boys it never entirely left at all. That is its own long story, told in another place. What matters here is that the war, for the men who lost it, ended not in a battle, but in exhaustion. Cold, hungry, frightened young men coming down off the rock with their hands empty. Which brings us, finally, to the moment of contact, to what the curved knives actually did when they reached the men who had spent a month afraid of them. Because the record here is not silent. It is, in fact, remarkably specific. And it is the exact opposite of the legend. On the abandoned ground around Tumbledown, a group of Gurkhas came upon several Argentine medical personnel who appear to have stayed behind to tend the wounded. The Gurkhas took them prisoner, and then they drew their kukris. The prisoners, by every account that survives, were certain in that moment that this was the end they had been promised: the curved knife, the single stroke, the rumour made flesh. One of the Gurkha officers, Captain Rai, remembered it plainly years afterward. The Argentines, he said, were terrified that the men were going to take off their heads. The knives had been drawn to cut shoelaces. The Gurkhas needed something to bind the prisoners' hands, and a bootlace was what was to hand, and the kukri was the tool nearest the work. The same way you or I might reach for the knife in a kitchen drawer. There was no stroke, no blood, no rumour fulfilled. There was a soldier cutting a lace, and a row of terrified young men slowly understanding that the thing they had been told for a month was not going to happen to them. The Gurkhas had to reassure them, and a few hours later those same prisoners were in a compound, alive, fed, and on their way to being sent home. In another incident, a single Gurkha patrol took the surrender of a group of Argentines armed with anti-aircraft weapons without a shot being fired between them, simply by holding up the kukri so it could be seen. The blade did the work it had always done in this war. It did it by being looked at, and never once by being used. So what do we do with the bigger, darker stories? The ones the Argentine press carried after the war, the throats opened in single strokes, the dozens of men taken in a night, the soldiers so far gone that they had to be restrained. The Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, no less, repeated a version in which the Gurkhas were so far beyond control that the English had to handcuff them to make them stop. It is a magnificent piece of storytelling. It is also, on the evidence, untrue. Major Sear, who was there, who served in the battalion, and who spent years afterward going through both British and Argentine sources, called the worst of these accounts, in his own words, unmitigated tripe, utter rubbish. The hard figures bear him out. Against the rumours of dozens or even hundreds taken by the curved knife, the actual record for the battalion is a single soldier lost, and he was lost after the surrender, in an accident clearing the old battlefield, not in any fight, and roughly 15 men wounded, almost all by shellfire. The legend spoke of a reckoning that the arithmetic simply does not contain. Why then did the stories survive? Sear offered an answer that has the ring of truth to it, and it is a kind one toward the men who spread them. A defeated army, he said, needs a reason. It is easier to have lost to monsters from the mountains who do not fight fair than to admit you were cold, hungry, badly led, and beaten by ordinary men. The Gurkhas, exotic and silent and carrying that famous knife, made a convenient explanation. And so the very reputation that had emptied the trenches before the fighting was put to a second use afterward, to explain the emptying. The rumour worked twice. It frightened the boys into surrender, and then it let the boys' country tell itself that the surrender had been forced by something inhuman, rather than by something as human and as ordinary as fear. There is one more thing the record asks us to hold on to, and it is the thing that should stay with you longest. We have spent this whole account inside the Argentine trench, looking out, and we should end one step closer to honest. The dread was real, and the dread was disproportionate. The Gurkhas won a great deal of that war without firing on a single man. But the reason the dread was so disproportionate is the same reason the prisoners walked away alive. These were not the monsters of the rumour. They were among the most disciplined soldiers on the island. A less disciplined unit, handed an enemy that had spent a month believing the worst of them, might have been tempted to live up to the story. The Gurkhas were not. They drew the knife to cut a lace, reassured the men who shook in front of them, and marched them down off the hill. The reputation that terrified an army turned out, at the moment it mattered most, to be a reputation for something other than what the rumour claimed. It was a reputation for control. In the end, the thing the conscripts feared most was the thing that saved them. The men they had been told would cut their throats in the dark took their surrender instead, fed them, and marched them down off the mountain alive. The legend that had terrified an army turned out, at the moment of contact, to be a story about discipline, about soldiers good enough that they never needed to become the monsters the rumour had made them. The Gurkhas won a great deal of that war before they arrived, and when they did arrive, they proved the rumour wrong in the only way that mattered, by letting the frightened boys in the trenches live to tell it.